Weary travellers of the internet, today I'm going to do the impossible. I'm going to say the unsayable. And I'm going to take a stance which fundamentally breaks the rules of interaction on the internet. That's right, folks. I am going to advocate feminism. The only things missing from that intro, I feel, were fedoras. 50,000 spinning fedoras hurtling through the air as the feminazis, through their unreasonable demands of reproductive rights and sexual freedom, consequently destroy the basis for the existence of all life on Earth. But unfortunately, I lack the editing software necessary to convey this, so I apologise. So in this video I'd like to talk about feminism and why I think it's a necessary component of anarchism. Now, for a while I had some very anti-feminist views that I really don't want to repeat. I spend a lot of time on the internet and there's a lot of anti-feminist sentiment on YouTube. And at the time I had some pretty reactionary views in general. So I bought into the anti-feminist viewpoint, unfortunately. However, since adopting an anarchist way of thinking, I've come to the conclusion that if I'm to be an anarchist, I cannot not be a feminist. And no, I'm not saying, hey, I support women's rights, give me a sticker. It's just fairly straightforward, and there are a number of reasons why this is the case. As I've said in my previous videos, anarchism holds that social hierarchy, that is to say, a form of organisation where people are ranked one above another in terms of status and authority, does not justify itself. Unless a justification can be given, particularly by those who exercise such authority, then it should be dismantled from below and replaced with a more free and equitable relationship. And bear in mind, of course, that the form of authority that anarchists are particularly critical of is distinct from authority that's based on knowledge, competence and reason. So, for example, it's distinct from the authority that a good doctor has on medicine. Rather, we're talking about sort of subordination, regimentation and obedience. That's what this is about. If this is what we mean by anarchism, then feminism is basically the application of an anarchist analysis towards patriarchy. Feminism holds that a form of hierarchy exists called patriarchy, in which men are vested with power and status and authority, whereas women are expected to be subservient, passive and obedient. This form of hierarchy expresses itself in numerous ways, through the political system, through the economic system, through culture, through the media and in the home and so on. Feminism holds that this form of hierarchy is unjust and unnecessary, and therefore it should be dismantled to be replaced with gender equality. So feminism takes the same anarchist path of identifying a form of hierarchy, questioning whether or not it can be legitimised in any way, and dismantling it if it fails to meet its burden of proof. Given that hierarchies based on something as arbitrary as gender are clearly illegitimate, anarchists must advocate gender equality. However, let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that feminism, equalism and masculinism all make the same normative claim that gender equality ought to exist. Why is it then that an anarchist should be a feminist rather than an equalist or a masculinist? Well, that's easy. To understand why this is the case, we can assess the truth value of the descriptive claims that each of these standpoints make about the existing world. Simply put, the feminist description of gender relations that exist in the world today is simply a more accurate representation of reality than the equalist and masculinist ones. I should add though that before I go into more detail, I'm not an objective observer. I'm a guy, and because of that I'm going to be more likely to deny that in our society men are in a position of illegitimate authority over women. I'm not best fit to judge this claim, for the same reason that a massively wealthy CEO of a giant multinational corporation is probably not best fit to judge the claim that capitalism is based on the exploitation of workers. This is one of the reasons why feminists will sometimes say, check your privilege. It's nothing to do with censorship or silencing people, it's just about getting people to consider their own position and how that might affect their perception of the world. Which actually makes a fair bit of sense. But first off, I'd like to begin by addressing the equalist or humanist or gender egalitarian position and why I basically think it's crap. Equalism in its shoulder-shrugging and refusal to acknowledge any systemic form of gendered hierarchy has never ever constituted a serious social movement in the pursuit of change. Rather, I find that equalism plays a different role, which is that of telling the feminists off when they want people to change their behaviour too much. The Amazing Atheist is a classic example of this, preserving existing gender relations under the guise of equality.
You can't be for the rights of one or the other. If you're truly for equality, you have to be for the rights of both.
TJ, I'm sure that your commitment to equality is sincere, but this is really just liberal bullshit. There's no analysis here of power concentrations. Everything's just this atomised, individual injustice. And there's just this refusal to consider whether there might be a pattern here, or whether these injustices might all have something in common, or whether there's an overarching system that's responsible. The kind of argument that you're making here is like saying that you're not in favour of economic equality unless you advocate for the rights of the rich as well as the rights of the poor, which is bollocks, because anyone who cares about economic equality knows that the rights of workers are held against the bosses, and it's the same principle here. You can't just look at lots of individual injustices and say, well, that's unfair. You have to look deeper and consider what the causes might be. And yes, men are sometimes the victims of injustice based on their gender, and this is illegitimate. But more often than not, this is because they will fail to conform with the gender roles that are designed to keep other men in a position of power. It's not because they're being oppressed by women. It's certainly not because of feminists. And now the cavalry will be deployed to tell me that not all men are misogynists. Yes, I fucking know. Nobody is suggesting that all men are misogynists, but simply that there is a distribution of power which is tilted in favour of men and against women. This does not imply that all men are misogynists. Responding to this claim with not all men is like saying, oh well, not all white people in 1960s Alabama were racists. It implies nothing about the distribution of power. I should also add that anyone describing themselves as a so-called humanist when it comes to gender politics is flat out ignoring the historic usage of the term. Humanism refers to a specific philosophical stance that emerged during the Enlightenment that emphasises the moral value of human beings and the role of reason and evidence in making decisions, moral or otherwise, as opposed to faith or authority as a basis for one's beliefs. This has nothing whatsoever to do with gender politics.
Everyone deserves equal rights. Everyone deserves the equal ability to accumulate whatever power and influence they can within their lives, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. I think we all agree on that. And that's why I've taken to calling myself a universal human self-determinist.
TJ, you are no such fucking thing. You believe in capitalism. You believe in the state. You believe in hierarchical structures of command and obedience which subordinate the masses to a political and economic elite, and yet you somehow seem to think that this is compatible with a free and equitable society for everybody. Why might this be the case? Because you're a fucking liberal.
There were leaders, and there were fucking underlings, and there were underlings beneath the underlings, and then there was the absolute fucking crust, the shit turds stuck to the floor of their society. We always have that. We always do that. Every fucking social species on the planet does it.
Wow, TJ, you must be really fond of the working class with that attitude. I suppose I'd better revoke my IWW union membership and learn to know my place. Try reconciling unquestioning support for authoritarian structures of social domination with the belief that people should be free to determine their own lives. Now that's what I call cognitive dissonance. With that tangent aside, what's called gender egalitarianism is a complete sham, and so is the men's rights movement. MRAs do not care about equality. The idea that the power distribution in our society is somehow tilted in favour of women and against men is just flatly inconsistent with reality, even in the wonderful, enlightened Western world, before you jump down my throat about that. A study by Lane Kenworthy and Melissa Malami found that in 1998, in 146 countries around the world, not one of them had a majority of women in political office. And just to be clear, I don't think that trying to get women a seat at the table in the government or having more female capitalists is really the answer. I think these institutions are inherently oppressive in and of themselves, and they should be smashed. That's why I take the anarcho-feminist position that, so long as some women are rich and some women are poor, there can be no women's liberation. distribution, and the same goes for other systems of oppression. But seriously, if all of the centres of political power just so happen to be occupied by men, and that's not reflective of a patriarchal society, then I don't know what is. And of course, whenever you try to talk about patriarchy, people will just try and use class as a red herring, like this for example.
When it comes to the distribution of power, you're going to find that it's always been the rich have power and the poor don't. Not the men have power and the women don't.
But this is a completely false dichotomy because the two positions are jointly consistent. Both of these claims can be true at the same time. And in fact they are. Our society is dominated by rich men. Rich white men. Rich straight white men. Rich cisgendered straight white men. Able-bodied, rich, cisgendered, straight white men, and so on and so forth. All of these hierarchies can and do overlap and intersect with one another. When people talk about cis-male privilege, for example, they aren't suggesting that if you're a cis-male, you must automatically be totally free from all other forms of oppression. On the contrary, if you're a cisgendered gay man, then you're oppressed on the grounds of your sexual orientation. If you're a cisgendered working class man, you're oppressed on the grounds of your economic position, and so on. Nobody is suggesting that if you're a cisgendered man, that you are not subject to any other system of oppression at all. No. All they're saying is that you are not subjected to systematic oppression specifically on the grounds of your gender identity. But nevertheless, the MRAs and the so-called equalists will continue to misrepresent the feminist position because, hey, it's much easier to build up a straw argument, knock that down and pretend that you've addressed your opponent's position than it is to actually address your opponent's position. People continue to act as though feminism is not relevant in the Western world, despite the very real problems that women in the West face on a regular basis. A study published in the European Journal of Social Psychology found that both men and women perceive women as a mishmash of sexual parts, whereas men are perceived as being full people. A study at Washington State University also found that men who read magazines which sexually objectify women are less likely to respect sexual boundaries. Sexual objectification exists as a real problem in our society, and it has negative consequences towards the sexual freedom of women. And if you have half the population that are being treated like they're objects rather than people, that's a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Not just if you're an anarchist, but just as a matter of general human decency. And with all of the evidence in mind, I think it's almost impossible to deny that women are oppressed in our society. If you're an anarchist, by which I mean that you constantly apply this process of identifying, challenging and dismantling illegitimate authority, and you're aware that this form of hierarchy exists, I don't see how you couldn't be a feminist. Either you A, aren't aware that this form of hierarchy exists, B, are aware that it exists, but you feel that it's justified, and good luck defending that position by the way, or C, you are aware that it exists, but you want to briefly suspend your critical attitude towards hierarchy and pretend that it doesn't for little to no logical reason whatsoever. And that just sounds like denialism. Patriarchy furthers other illegitimate systems of oppression as well. For example, if you have a population of people that are raised in patriarchal families where they're just socialized into mindlessly obeying the father all of the time, then they're going to be far more likely to accept the idea that there has to be some ruling power overseeing society all the time from above. Not to mention the fact that capitalists make a shit ton of money out of gendered marketing and so on. Not only is patriarchy illegitimate in and of itself, but it also furthers other illegitimate systems of oppression that are also opposed by anarchists. And with all of this in mind, any consistent and informed anarchist has no excuse not to be a feminist. And that is why feminism is a necessary component of anarchism.